Hi, and a very good evening to everyone who has joined us for this extremely special session. I would like to welcome you to the fourth episode of Season 2 of the YIF podcast, a live and interactive webinar series. The theme for the series is The Professor Will See You Now. Please join me for a candid conversation with a YIF faculty about their journey, YIF course, and some ideas that drive them. Our guest for today is Professor Urvashi Butalia, who is an author, publisher, and founder of Zubaan Books. And she is, of course, amongst India's most iconic and inspirational feminists. At the YIF, Urvashi teaches the course Women, Society, and Changing India. Thank you so much for doing this, Urvashi.
Thank
I
you.
have been given the daunting task of moderating this session, but I'm extremely grateful to the YF team for asking me to be in conversation with Urvashi. I am Surya from the YF class of 2018 and currently work with the Times Group as Chief of Staff to Samir Jain, Vice Chairman, Bennett Coleman and Company Limited. I've had the great privilege of being Urvashi's teaching assistant at the YIF, and I'm so excited to be back in conversation with her, albeit virtually. While I'm going to do my best, Urvashi, to keep the session structured for the benefit of our audience, which I've been told is a mix of alum and aspiring fellows, the team has also given us the leeway to be as candid as possible. So I also hope to make this fun and engaging with you. The alum joining us today would surely recall Urvashi's quotable quote, which is "Feminism is messy." And so I'm going to kind of take shelter under this very same umbrella. And my apologies in advance to everyone if our chat kind of is messy and all around the place as well. But I hope there's some takeaways for everybody who's joined in. And thank you very much to all our audiences who have joined in. And please use the Q&A box to drop in your questions through the chat. And I'd be happy to put them forth to our esteemed guest for the day. So jumping straight into it, no pun intended, let's kind of let Urvashi kind of take a bit of time to jump into the masterclass part of it. Urvashi, if you want to start with that, and then we'll go into some questions from me and the audience, and we'll take it from there. Thank you.
Okay, Surya, thank you so much. Thanks, YIF, for asking me to be here. And hello, everyone who's listening. Thank you all for coming. So I'm delighted to be here. I'm talking to you from my kitchen, which is where I do most of my work at the work at home thing. It's the only place in my house that has any light. And it's warm and comfortable. And in summer, it's really hot because it doesn't have a fan. So the last few days of being here. Now, I'm meant to do a short masterclass or mistress class, as I would like to call it. But I'm not really going to do that. It's late and I think you must be exhausted. So what I thought I would do is put a few things to you to think about. And I'd begin by mentioning some current developments. First, the arrest of young Disha Ravi in the toolkit case on fairly serious charges. And earlier, the arrest of Nodeep Kaur for reporting on the farmers' protests. And today, the victory of Priya Ramani in the courts in the case of defamation filed against her by MJ Akbar. So these developments, and you know, these are not the only ones, there are many such, they show us the different realities of women's lives. And I think back to 3 or 4 decades ago when there would not have been a Nodeep Kaur because women journalists would not have been allowed to report on things like farmers' agitations. Equally, 30 or 40 years ago, Priya Ramani would not have had the kind of support she's had today to fight her case. So we can see that some victories are possible for women in India, but also that with the victories come increasing dangers and increasing vulnerabilities of when women are out in the public space. And you see that with the case of young Disha, who's only 22 and who was doing what so many young students are concerned about, the environment, fighting for against climate change and for the environment and so on. So, these cases made me think back to the days when people of my generation, and I shan't tell you how old I am, but I am old, people of my generation became involved in the women's movement. And I was more or less the same age as Disha when I became involved. We began our protests in the universities, and we fought for safe transport, we fought for women's rights in hostels, and so much more. And over the years, as these protests grew, we went on to fight against dowry deaths, violence against women, especially sexual assault and rape, women's health issues, questions of religion and religious freedom, the discrimination against women in law, the battle for national and regional policies on women, and so on and so forth. All of these were issues that we fought for. We fought against the state, against corporates when they came to India, but we also negotiated with the state and participated in helping in the framing of laws and much more. So when I look back at that time from the vantage point of today, for me, several things stand out. One of them is the fact that women's activism, the battles fought by women for their rights, are not really a flash in the pan. They didn't happen and then disappear. Instead, as new generations came along, they brought their issues to the battle and they've chosen new modes of protest, new ways to mobilize, and they've used new technologies to take their messages further. And to me, this is really interesting. But change, and I believe there has been change, hasn't been linear. It never is. It's been a sort of zigzag process, 2 steps forward, 1 step back. There have been no easily identifiable beginnings and endings, but a constant kind of kaleidoscope of movements, protests, campaigns, both at a collective and at an individual level. And when I look at the women's movement in this country, what I see is a kind of mosaic where many things are happening sort of at the same time. The tragedy for someone like me, who is also a publisher and a writer and a teacher, is that the history of this really important force of change has not been written, or that it has been written, but not as extensively as it should have been, and not in as many languages as it should have been. And if it has been written at all, it hasn't found its way into textbooks and pedagogy. So for young people who become involved in the movement today, or for those who have a curiosity about it, there's little to tell them that there is a history that's led them to this point. And I want to give you an example. The Metoo movement, which many of you would be familiar with, it's a current and really important manifestation of a process that began many years ago in the late 80s and the early 90s. And this is from what we know. It may well have begun earlier, but we don't have any knowledge of that. And it began because of 2 women, a police officer called Rupandeol Bajaj, a government officer, and a low caste woman from Rajasthan called Bhauri Devi. The POSH Act and the Vishakha guidelines that predated the act came out of these women's stories. These are really significant developments. And Priya Ramani, for example, would not have been standing tall today had it not been for the path that was opened up by a woman called Bhauri, by a woman called Rupandeol Bajaj. So ask yourselves, and this is a question I often ask my students, how many of the courses you take at universities take note of these histories? How many have questions of gender inbuilt into them? And I'm not talking only about gender studies courses, I'm talking about engineering, about politics, about social sciences, about architecture, and so on and so forth. Of course, the history is not an easy one to write. And a question that I often ask in my classes is, how and where do we begin to trace a history of women? How do we trace what is basically an absence? What are the tools that we use? The existing tools, which are seen to be the fundamentals of research, particularly historical research, such as documents, records left behind by rulers, coins, and such like, they tell us little or zero about women. So how do we trace this history at all? And an important question, which my students ask me, why should we trace it if we have so long managed to live without it? So these are some of the questions we try to answer in our discussions in the course that I teach. I'm not going to try and offer you answers to these questions because, as Surya said, my tagline is feminism is messy. These answers are also messy. But I do want to say that if we do trace these hitherto silenced histories, we learn so much more about our society and see how women have been central to bringing about change. I'll give you just one example of this. You've heard about Bhauri and Rupandeol Bajaj. So in Tamil Nadu, there is a woman called Sharifa Khanum who began many years ago an organization called the Muslim Women's Jamaat. And how Sharifa began this organization is that in 1988, she came to a conference in Patna, a women's conference, where she was given the work of translating what the women were talking about from Hindi and English, which were the languages of the conference, into Tamil for those women who had come from Tamil. And when Sharifa sat and listened to women talking about domestic violence, about sexuality, about all kinds of issues that were close to them, she began to think that, my God, these things can actually be articulated. That here we are in a safe space and we are giving voice, these women are giving voice to things which have so far always been silenced. And she thought perhaps she could do it as well. She went home and she set up a women's group to talk, just to have conversations among women in a safe space. And from those conversations, developed this organization called Muslim Women's Jamaat, following the pattern of the Jamaat, which is a council of village elders, which solves those matters which don't need to go up to courts or people don't want to take them to courts, and which had always traditionally been male. So Sharifa cleverly read up the Quran and discovered that nowhere in the Quran did it say that the Jamaat members had to be male. And so she decided to form a Muslim Women's Jamaat, which today has thousands of members. And there is a wonderful film made on them by a woman called Deepa Dhanraj, and the film is called Invoking Justice. If you get a chance, you should see it. So my question is, if one woman can make such a major change, imagine what women can do at a collective level. And it's the stories of women on the ground that tell us about the possibility of change, the ways in which women achieve this change, and how important that change is. So I think also for me, what makes the study of women's movements and feminism so interesting is that this is one of the few movements in the world that has not had singular leaders, that has somehow managed to retain the spirit of the collective. This is not to say that within women's movements there haven't been power struggles. They have, and plenty of internal differences as well. But women's movements across the world have faced up to the challenges of being questioned from within. And the questions have been many on religion, on caste, on sexual identity, on so much more. But the history of women is not a triumphalist history. It's a history that is human, that's vulnerable, that's open to question, and therefore much more interesting. It's a history that collapses the borders between what is personal and what is political, between the home and the world. It shows you, it allows you to understand violence, for example, as not being a single occurrence on a particular day for a particular person, but as being something structural, systemic, located on a continuum that extends from the home, the domestic space, to the outside world, to the frontiers and borders of the country. It's a history that allows us to understand our world in ways that no previous histories have done. And it's a history that opens doors on so many other forms of marginalization. And when I try to look, as I do all the time, for explanations of why this history has been so silenced and so marginalized, the only answer I can come up with is perhaps because it is so deep, because it is so personal, because it is so intimate, because it is so borderless, it's a history that people fear, and therefore they want to put it aside. But it's something that we must and should study. And that's what I try to do in the course that I offer at Ashoka. So Surya, I'm going to stop there and over to you for whatever questions you have. I have to say that one of my achievements with somebody like Surya and several of my students is to get them to call me Urvashi, to call me by my first name, because it's always professor and ma'am, and it's hard when somebody is quite a bit older than you to use first names, but I'm glad you did so, Surya. That's a great achievement.
Thank you, Professor. I'm doing that on purpose, just to kind of no, but you know very well my struggle with having reached this point where I could just call you Urvashi, but I'm glad I've reached this point as well. But to go back to all that you said, Urvashi, thank you so much for that foundational mistress class, so to speak. And just to draw on the title of today's session itself, The Personal is Political, Reflections on a Feminist Life. I mean, often there's much ado about nothing about the word feminist itself. So I kind of want to just ask you to reflect on your personal experience of when you first heard of the word feminism. What was your entry point into not just the movement, but just the literal word feminism, and what that did for the rest of your career as a writer, thinker, publisher, and now a professor, of course.
Okay, yes, I did intend to talk about the personal journey. Then I changed my mind at the last minute and I forgot to tell you. Sorry about that, but we'll talk about it now a little bit. I don't remember really. It seems to me when I think back, because feminism to me is like breathing, seems to me that it's where I've always been. But I guess if you put, I'm to put a time to it, as a concept that I began to understand intellectually and instinctually, it's something that I came across when I was at university, right, which would have been in the late 60s, early 70s, because the university, Delhi University, which is where I was a space of a huge amount of ferment and political mobilization at that time. A lot of the spin-off came from left movements, the Naxalite movement and others, and we were all kind of churning up and talking about those. And in those, the experiences of women who had been involved in a whole range of political movements previous to that, and who had been raising questions of patriarchy, sexual violence, etc., in those movements, those became talking points. So that's when I think we began to read a lot about feminism as well. And to me, basically, it was something that spoke to me very deeply. And from the beginning, I felt that I could own this concept because I found it very enabling. But at the same time, I also realized that for many women, as a label, it would carry certain kinds of things, connotations, I guess, which they would not want to own. And to me, that was fine. If somebody didn't want to call themselves feminist, that's fine. That's a choice they make. Though for those who want to call themselves feminists, that's a choice they make. And to me, it's a very, very important part of me. But that doesn't mean I'll diss people who don't want to call themselves that. I need to understand why, where they're coming from, etc.
Right. Got it. And I mean, just to kind of focus on your time at DU a little bit more, could you maybe share with us a couple of either experiences or anecdotes that you recall that really stick out in your mind as inspirational points or turning points in all that you've done in life so far, or maybe even like people you've come across or engaged with or met and who've sparked thought or inspiration?
Yeah. Well, there are many, but one of the things was that in Miranda House, which is the college I went to in Delhi University, and I was really proud to go to that college because it was a college that had students of all classes. It wasn't particularly elite at that time, and it was also a college that offered science courses and all sorts of things. At Miranda House, all freshers were expected to participate in a beauty contest. So we were all made to wear high heels and wear saris because, of course, you wouldn't be allowed to walk around in a swimsuit. So wear high heels and totter about on the stage. And then we were given the task of organizing beauty contests in the next year and the next year. And that was my first exposure to the idea of beauty contests. And we kind of protested about it in the next year because as freshers, we couldn't. Right. But it wasn't until much later that when I became an activist much later, that we built up a kind of strong movement of protests. And then, of course, even rethought that. So that was one interesting thing for us. The other was Delhi University at that time was very badly serviced by public transport. So from where I lived, there was one bus, the number 57 bus, that went to the university, and it only came once an hour. Mm-hmm. And it was so crowded. I mean, you can't imagine today when you see the bus system in Delhi, what buses were like then. but each bus would have like 300 people in it, and people would be hanging on the side of the door, which is the opposite side from the driver, and they would be tilting like this.
Yeah.
And as women, we had to jump over the bus seats to
Right.
get to wherever we wanted to go, or to get out. So we demanded from the university that they give us university special buses. We got those, but then what happened in those was they would be parked outside Miranda House, and classes were over at 3:30, and students would pile into them because Miranda House was at one end of the university.
Right.
And when we'd come out after classes, we'd find that all the seats had been occupied by guys. And the guys would be sitting like big mushtandas with their legs played out. They would be taking all three seats, and you had to ask them for permission. And then when they allowed you to sit down, at every turn of the bus, they leaned into you and over you, and all forms of physical contact were forced on you, which you didn't like. So then we fought for and got ladies specials. And ladies specials today are, I think, the parent of the metro compartments, the stupid pink compartments for women. But they have a history. So that's why I'm forever emphasizing the history. But it's, foundational moments or those kinds of moments. There were many in the university, but I want to tell you one that happened with my first job. So after my MA, where my tutor was a legendary woman called Krishna Isaulov, who was married to a Russian at that time and had a son called Vladimir, who none of us had ever seen, and we were all in love with his picture and determined to marry him because he was Russian. But she was an amazing teacher, and she wanted me to teach English literature, and I was determined by the end of college not to do so because I was fed up of Spencer and Milton. I was living in Jangpura and fighting gundas on the road, and Spencer and Milton had nothing to do with my reality. So I was determined to do a different job, and by accident, pure accident, I got some freelance work in a publishing house, Oxford University Press, where I got a job of a very sort of inglorious job called being a paster upper. And basically, the Oxford University Press at that time was still in the colonial mold, and they were adapting British textbooks to Indian schools. So all they were doing was John and Mary, names of British kids, had to be changed to Ram and Sita. So my job was to get lots of Rams, cut them up and paste them over John, and lots of Sitas and paste them over Mary. So Ram was a bit of a thing because the 3 letters you paste over 4, you have to keep space on either side. And this pasting had to be done with a glue called rubber solution, which is used for bicycle tires. I became very familiar with bicycle shops in Delhi, and they had employed an artist whose job it was to color blonde hair black and blue eyes black and cut the tops of double-decker buses. Now that was my introduction to publishing, and I fell head over heels in love with it and have stayed there all my life.
Right.
For me, that was a really foundational moment.
Got it. Urvashi, since we segued from history to the personal, I'd just like to take a question from the audience and not kind of keep it all for the end. There's someone who's asking, what are some of the places one could look at to learn more about Herstory?
Well, I think today you have many sources, and the first thing to do is go to Google Auntie, I guess, and search there. But there are women's libraries across the world, and there are different archives that have been set up. If you search for women's libraries, you'll find the Fawcett Library in London, you'll find a library in Amsterdam. Right. You could go on the websites of many Indian organizations also. I mean, we are trying to set up an archive of resources for women's history and to do 100 years of women's history in graphic stories. That's the plan for the future. But if you do Google searches, I think you'll come across quite a lot of material. And then there's a newspaper, or not a newspaper, magazine called Feminism in India, which does a lot of women's history stories. You should look those up. Those will lead you to other sources. Yeah. So many ways like this.
And of course, by Zubaan Books.
Yeah, of course. Well, I can't be publicizing our books, but yes, Surya said it. So by Zubaan Books. Yeah. There's a book we did called The History of Doing, which has a history up to the 90s at least.
Right, right. Now to kind of go into something that you said about ideology and internal conflicts within feminisms. Um, I just wanted to ask, was there for you personally and generally for probably a lot of your contemporaries, an intersection between when an ideological enlightenment, so to speak, and a feminist enlightenment intersected? And have you seen contemporaries or colleagues, quote unquote, switch or cross over to the other side? And how do you still reconcile like differences and yet remain within solidarities of feminism?
So there have been many such instances. One of the things that I remember, which actually made me really rethink my own assumptions, because you never think that you are in any way prejudiced. Your self-image is one of being very open and inclusive and not casteist and not upper class, etc. But you don't realize how much of that baggage you carry with you. So, for example, when we named our first publishing house, we called it Kali after the goddess Kali. But we never thought at that time that that was a Hindu symbol, and the political context around us was not as polarized as it is today.
Right.
So, at some point during the course of that, the life of that publishing house, this question began to be raised. Why a religious name? Why a religious Hindu name? It became very difficult for our Pakistani counterparts to work with us, for example. And none of us questioned how, in the women's movement, because the most articulate voices in the movement were often upper class and often Hindu, or often upper caste and Hindu, that we had automatically chosen many of the symbols of empowerment as Hindu symbols, Shakti and Shri and this, that, and the other. And it was at a women's conference, I can't remember exactly which year it was, that Flavia Agnes, a lawyer from Bombay, sat us all down. This was in Kolkata at a women's studies conference. And she accused us and said, face up to it, the women's movement, the leadership of the women's movement, you're majoritarian. You are only using Hindu symbols. What about women like me? What about Christian women? And also she challenged us on the question of religion, that the women's movement, feminism, had kind of discarded religion like, opium of the masses kind of attitude, that we are a secular force, until we realize what part religion played in women's lives and how for many women it was important. And they were wanting to fight it from within, just as women within marriages might fight patriarchy from within. So those questions came up for us, and Flavia was the first one to flag these. That's the first time that I actually started to question. Presently, there are many, many debates. Some of them are generational, but some of them are, for example, the divide between Dalit feminists and so-called mainstream feminists is a divide that is based on a very legitimate set of questions that Dalit feminists raise, saying, if our voices are not there in this movement, it is not our movement. You have to listen to, reflect, move aside. The leadership has to change, all of that. And this is a big challenge. And yet, even though, for example, in the movement, there are very different ways of thinking about sex work, which Dalit women have one point of view, many others have another point of view. But what's important and remarkable is that the conversation has never stopped.
Right.
So I think that's really what we take away from that. And that's what I meant by living. I mean, the differences are there. It's not that they're not there.
Right, right, right. And thank you for that. I mean, that really kind of also provokes thought in all of us who, as you said, often think of ourselves as inclusive and near perfect and, feminist and woke, so to speak. But as I was discussing with a friend just the other day, like wokeness, I don't think is ever like a place one reaches. It's like a daily sort of struggle or endeavor to continue to be woke, and to kind of check oneself and introspect. And I often struggle with various points from the past, and probably even the present and in the future, where one has to kind of think about one's actions, words, beliefs, ideologies, and kind of make, as one would say, maybe either reparations, or kind of check oneself and try to be better and acknowledge one's limitations, and limitations as a person or as a feminist, and kind of take it from there. And on that note, I just want to ask you, Urvashi, before we kind of change tack a little bit, as a feminist thinker or a publisher, could you possibly comment on maybe the hopes, fears, and challenges of the times we live in? And are there things that kind of keep you up at night, but at the same time, what, in terms of being optimistic, what are the things that allow you to go to sleep?
Yeah, well, metaphorically, yes, there are many things that keep me up at night. Physically, there isn't a lot, because by the time I go to bed, I'm so tired that I just fall asleep. But metaphorically, yes. I think, Surya, the times are, as we know, very, very difficult, very hard. It's you have two things happening. I see a young generation, your generation, people who are younger than you, the people I meet as my students, both men and women, who are actually so curious about in trying to understand the realities around them,
right,
who are so open and who are full of questions. And I think that really this generation deserves a future in which they can be free to think the way they want to and express themselves the way they want to. But the forces we are living with at the moment are quite against that, and it is very difficult and very hard and often dangerous. So, often I think that we have had it very lucky in many ways, my generation of people, because we could be involved in political protests. We could be as Andolan Jivi as we wanted to. And we could do it. It was possible.
Right.
It's much more difficult now. And that can mean many things, I think it can mean that fear keeps people sort of in a pliant state, and I don't think that that's a healthy state to be in. I think idealism, anger, protest, these are the very stuff of democracy, and they have to be there. Free expression, all of these things. But there are things that give me hope, and there are things like young Disha and others protesting, like our girls from Pinjratod who are in jail and who have been in jail for so long. But, they're keeping up their spirits. And I think when they come out, they will come out fighting. In our own work, it's a tremendous dilemma, which I have not yet been able to figure out what one does, because you want to be more outspoken, and yet now, for example, if I run an organization, I'm responsible for 10 jobs. And can I just go out there and state my politics and put those jobs at risk? What is more important? What do I do? These are the kind of questions you get confronted with, real life questions. And you try not to let them influence your work, but I can't honestly say that they don't.
Right.
But I think that confronting these questions also gives us hope for the future, because out of these will come ways of functioning that will allow us to survive.
Right. Got it. And I think that also answers one of the questions we had in the chat box that asked, how does one feel safe as a woman to also be an activist today? So this, I think your answer kind of encapsulates it, but if you have anything to add, please go ahead, Urvashi.
I think it's tough. I think you have to, it's tough and it's risky, and you have to see if you're willing to take the risk, but not all kinds of activism are risky. And it's true that change can come in many different ways. So you have to try and figure out what's the best way for you to do it and whether you're willing to take risks or not. For us, for example, one thing that I'm very clear about as a publisher and a writer is that it is really the most important thing is for us to keep women's voices alive.
Right.
And to keep on publishing. So we'll keep on doing that till we drop. But we will employ some strategies to, for example, you publish a book which is strongly political. We published a book 5 years ago on the Kunan Poshpora rape case of 1991 in Kashmir. Today, that book would be difficult to publish.
Right.
So we would have to find a way of doing it where maybe you don't call attention to the actual incident in the title, but you promote it in such ways that people know. So you have to think of practical solutions so that you don't stop doing what you're doing. I think it's very important to do that, but you do it more carefully.
Right. And at that point, I'd also quickly take in another question from the audience, which is, how do you describe the relation between cinema and feminism, and what do you think the future of this would be? I'd just like to add something to this question in context of just your previous answer, in terms of censorship and cinema, and where even we're looking at regulation of OTT platforms going, not just in terms of religion and anti-national activities and stuff like that, but what is considered accepted in terms of even under the feminist umbrella.
See, I think it's a very complicated question because cinema is a very broad kind of category. Let me just say, for example, that if you look at Bollywood, let's say we start with looking at Bollywood.
Yeah.
The ways in which feminists have looked at Bollywood have undergone a lot of change from initial suspicion and outright rejection to looking at subversions and resistance within films and within Bollywood films, to trying to understand, for example, the expressions of sexuality. And if I don't know whether your generation will remember this song that created Choli Ke Piche, which was the one that created a huge debate because within the feminist movement, because many people felt it was a great expression of the woman's sexuality, and others felt that it was actually vulgar and offensive and so on. So there are divisions like that, and there has been much change on that thinking. On the question of censorship, I think pretty much within feminism, most people would agree that censorship is not something that they approve of, because really speaking, who are these censors? Where do they come from? And if they're government appointees, like you saw that last fellow who was the head of the censor board, it's a load of rubbish that they will censor out sex, but they won't censor out violence. Yeah. It's like, where is that thinking coming from? And I think people are adult enough to choose what they want to watch and they don't want to watch. And censorship is like infantilizing your population and saying, we know what's good for them. On the regulation of OTT platforms, also, in some ways, Surya, I think that states need to get realistic about these things because they can do whatever they want to do, but people will find ways around them. Youngsters will find ways to hack into systems, to find pirated websites, to watch what they want to do. So what are you achieving? So I don't know. I think this is something that in the 21st century, we really have to rethink, because information is so freely available. And no matter how many rules and regulations you put, it's not going to, people are not going to be, abide by that. Why should they?
Yeah, in fact, one might kind of realize that it could be highly counterproductive to the state, or anyways. So on that note, I just like to kind of take this conversation to for the benefit of some of our applicants to the YIF who have tuned in to talk a little bit about the YIF and your course itself, and also Ashoka. So I'd like to kind of start off this part of our conversation by asking you to explain the genesis of the title of your course, Women, Society and Changing India, with a special emphasis on the changing India bit of it.
Okay, so in the beginning, when we did this course, so when I started it, we were thinking, and I'm a publisher, I struggle with titles all the time. I have to find sexy titles for my books and everything. So we were trying to find a title that would encapsulate the course, because it isn't only a course about feminism, it's a course about women and feminism. And sometimes those two things overlap, and sometimes they're a little bit different. They might be, as the question you started off with, there may be a lot of women who don't call themselves feminists. And of course, it's about society, because women live in society and changing India. So one thing is that the course is located in a moment of great change, the here and now in India. But the other thing is that this course tries to selectively map moments in the women's movement, in the history of women's movements in this country, when some change happened. And it tries to look at what you mean when you talk about change, and how do you map that change? How do you measure it? So it raises questions like that. And that's why it's called Changing India. It's like both located in an India that's changing, but also measuring and mapping change that happens in the movement, which obviously impacts India, and changes something. And so I believe something quite fundamental. May not be on a huge scale, may not be hugely visible, but it's very, very significant. So that's how the title came about.
Got it. And like, talking about sexy titles, I'm not sure you've heard this before, but like, it is a very sexy title, because Women's Society in Changing India comes to WSCI, and a lot of us just used to call it whiskey.
Oh,
So
hey, you didn't tell me that. That is my absolute favorite drink. If you had told me that, I would have been very delighted.
so this is serendipitous then. I thought it was like very planned that you would go for this abbreviation, but anyway.
But actually, I have to also say that my very first teaching assistants, Alicia and Shiv, they are also the ones who advised me on this title. So it wasn't entirely out of my imagination.
Their favorite poison as well. But Urvashi, you've been teaching at the YIF for, I think, 6 years now, 7 years?
So I think six or 7, yeah, maybe. I don't know, 6 maybe.
Yeah, and it's gone from, as we were just discussing, it's gone from being like a 1-class elective to then a 2-class elective to now a core course. So how has that transition been, and how's that experience been for you? And maybe if you could also just talk a little bit about how, and we've spoken about this personally, but how much you kind of also learn from the class as much as like we've learned from you about feminisms.
Actually, a huge amount, Surya. So when I started teaching, I had to be, and I'm not saying this to sound important, I had to be more or less dragged kicking and screaming into the teaching, for no other reason except that I have a full-time job. I run 2 organizations, Zubaan Publishers and Zubaan the NGO. I also write. I have no space in my life for this. So when Anu Prasad, who asked me to come and teach, asked me, I kept saying no. And she was very persistent, and she agreed to all the difficult conditions, including that I would teach only in the evening after my workday was over. And so I came along, and I came thinking, okay, I'll do it once and I'll see. But I came also because I was curious that I had all these ideas in my head, and I thought, let me see, this course will help me to crystallize them, to talk to young people about them. And as you know, the very first class I taught, I fell in love with them completely. I mean, I love the fact that there were so many young students who were curious, who wanted to learn about feminism, that half of them, or slightly under half of them, were guys. And I remember asking in my first class, I asked the guys, why are you doing this course? Because at that time it was elective. And I told them that 20 years ago, if I'd done this course, there would have been no men in it. And I still remember what they said to me. And one of the things that has stayed with me till this time is the very first answer I got to that, which was, I want to learn how to talk to my mother. And the other answer was that, we see the change happening in our women friends of our age, and we want to do right by them, and we don't know when we are crossing the boundary. And in the context of what you were saying earlier about feminism, I often think that you have to, and about when you recognize your own prejudices, that somewhere you have to understand that you are not only you personally, but you're also part of a history that's being played out, and you carry some of the responsibilities of that. So with this course, it allowed me to see what young people are thinking, to understand your concerns, and to be all the time challenged, and then to see the curiosity and receptivity of a history that young people did not know at all. And often I would ask questions, I would get asked questions, and I would have to go home and look them up and figure them out and come back. So it keeps you young, when you're growing old, interacting with young people, and really you learn about young people's concerns and how they're dealing with all this at home. It's just been amazing. Every cohort I have loved teaching. And now I worry, because I think, oh my God, Ashoka is going to retire me. What will I do? At some stage, they'll say you're too old to teach. And then what will I do? I'll really miss all these students. So for me, it's been great. And we have a lot of fun together, because we joke and students sing. And I remember walking into class one day when, I don't know if it was your cohort, they were playing Urvashi, take it easy, Urvashi on large screen.
It was definitely our cohort, I think.
It's been a lot of fun as well.
Yeah. Talking about fun and the course, one of the things that a lot of fellows look forward to, and also continue to remember years after the fellowship experience is done, are the presentations that happen at the end of Whiskey. And I just wanted to kind of pick your brain on, was there a particular reason you chose this mode of assessment over any other? And what does this do for the course, for the professor, and for the students in kind of thinking about and engaging with feminisms?
So, Surya, it does many things. I thought about it for very specific reasons. One, because feminism to me is about collective working. It is about understanding what your colleagues are saying, and it is about listening and respecting different points of view.
And conversation, as you said.
Yeah. So if you put people together in a team and they have to come up with an idea to do something as a team, they have to think about it, and they have to, this process of discussion, confrontation, negotiation, compromise, arriving at something that everybody's happy to, and joining creativities. It's a very important process.
Right.
So that to me was something that this, the group assignments brought. Then what happens is, when you're teaching a class, and all the classes are large, 90 plus, sometimes 105, 106, no matter how much personal contact you make with the students, you're not going to get to know every single one of them. Some are sitting at the back of the class. Even if I walk around all the time, even then, because it's that 2-hour slot. And here is a moment when every individual student is in front of me and doing what they like. So even if I haven't got to know them through, too well through the sessions, here is a time when the contact is one-on-one. Even if it's a team, it's immediate. They're looking into your eyes. They are performing, talking, reading. And they are, because they have the freedom to do what they want, I can see how they're thinking. I can see what motivates them to choose theater or to choose something else. For me, it is such a window into the creativity in your minds. Because think in unfettered ways and come up with things, and that I just love it. That day, I really look forward to that day.
Yeah.
And I carry it with me, and I am so sad that we have not recorded, preserved, archived, because I wish the other faculty and other students could see what's happening at those times.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm sure it's true of all batches, but I speak for many of my fellows from my cohort for sure, that that's like a day that remembers forever, etched in our memory for very many different reasons. It's deeply personal, and of course political, and emotional, artistic, intellectual, all of it together at the same time. And of course, being able to present all of those ideas and conversations to you kind of enriches it that much more. So thank you very much for that feminist pedagogical approach, I guess, of allowing each of us to connect with you as personally as possible and yet engage with the subject that you kind of would allow us to bring alive in class in very many different ways using our own talents and skills and ideas.
I know you have another, in an odd kind of way, the doing classes on Zoom this last pandemic year,
Right.
I had to rethink this group assignment, but we did something that worked, I think, quite nicely. But for me, that contact of with students, 100 students on Zoom, was quite a close contact because I can see your names.
Right.
You know, so the moment somebody asks a question, I can respond to them using their name, and it creates a closeness which in the physical classroom, if you don't know, and I can't learn up 100 names, which I hate. I want to learn up 100 names on day one, but I can't do it. So so that was very interesting for me, that personal contact online.
Absolutely, absolutely. I'd again like quickly jumping into some more audience questions. There's one that says, how does one build a career in feminism or feminist publishing?
In feminist publishing, it's damn difficult. So publishing, there are many careers which are very, very satisfying. They will not earn you a lot of money, but they'll give you a lot of job satisfaction because you're in the presence of new ideas all the time. And it's a very creative thing, but how to get into it, how to build a career in it. Publishing, sadly, is one of those professions where there is no easy career path. It's something that you don't have courses that lead you to it, that qualify you for it, and therefore you basically either have to know people or apply and do tests and see if you can get in. So I'm embarrassed to say it, but it's not an easy place to get into. But send in your CV, write, read, and it's possible that you might find something. How does one build a career in feminism? So feminism, I don't think, is a thing in which you build a career, but you build a career in whatever you want to and make that feminist. Bring your feminism to bear on that. And for that, look at every damn thing. Look at how the furniture is made. Are those chairs made with men in mind? If you're working in a factory, look at how the hard hats are made or overalls are made. Are those made with men in mind? If you're working in airlines, look at cockpit seats, they're made with men in mind. Look at technology, look at it. Bring your feminism to your job.
I mean, I'm sure that's not the reason why it is, but it's called a cockpit for God's sake. But anyway, there are a couple of questions on grad school and PhDs in gender studies and feminism. So would you have any particular advice for those who are aspiring to take up these paths, Urvashi?
Well, I don't know much about the American Academy, so I can only advise you on India. I think PhDs are offered in quite a few places now. I mean, the Ashoka started a PhD program. I don't know about whether it's gender studies, but I guess you can choose your subjects. But certainly other universities have them. Women's studies universities like SNDT and in Calicut, I forget the name of the university, or Jadavpur, other places, Ambedkar, all these places offer PhDs. About the States, I don't know much because I've never studied there. But I know that a lot of my students apply there, and there seem to be quite a lot of courses.
Right. Got it. There's a bunch of questions, Urvashi, next on whether feminism and topics and discussions around feminism are elite/privileged issues. And I guess if I could just kind of mold that question a little more, I mean, is it a little bit fresh for all of us to be sitting on a Zoom or sitting in a classroom at Ashoka discussing feminism and feminisms? And how do we kind of make feminism more accessible and equitable and take it, quote unquote, to the masses? I know your answer to this, but for the benefit of our audiences.
So I think there's many answers to this. I think you're absolutely right in saying, how do we, in an elite classroom like Ashoka, because those classrooms are elite, they are for people who can afford to pay the fees. And there may be an occasional student there who is on a scholarship and who may be from an underprivileged class. And it's not a very comfortable situation to be in, because there is an elite camaraderie which a student from the outside finds it difficult to enter. And I have had students like that who have felt marginalized because of their gender, because of their sexuality, because of their caste, all of those things. But I think it is a mistaken assumption to think that we are the feminists, we the elite are the feminists, and everybody else out there, the masses, are people that we need to change. Very often that you will find that we need to learn feminism from people on the ground, people who are much less privileged. I told you Sharifa Khanam's story. Sharifa is not an elite person. Okay, she comes from a rural part of Tamil Nadu, and she is a Muslim woman from a fairly working class family. But her feminism, I would say, it can fight any feminism anywhere in the world. I mentioned to you Bhavri Devi's story. Bhavri is a Dalit woman from Rajasthan, and if you see the way Bhavri dealt with the case, the gang rape that happened to her, it's a pretty amazing feminist story. I think our mistake is that because we talk of feminism and because the word comes from a Western history and it's a word in English, we think that it is limited only to us. Yeah. But the awareness of discrimination is much more widespread. The action on it stems from rural women. So the history of the movement, if you look at this, the movement of the 70s, etc., starts with rural women in Maharashtra who are fighting for their rights in huge movements, peasant movements. Yeah. It starts from rural women in Telangana. It starts from women in West Bengal. It does not start from people like us. We are the inheritors of that history. That's why it's so important to know what has happened before we came on the scene and to see where it started from. And that's when we'll understand that it's much bigger than us.
Right, absolutely. And I would kind of, in the interest of time, I think we can have a last couple of questions. There's a bunch on the box, and I would request people to continue sending them in. Maybe we can compile them and, segregate them and get those across to you. Just, I mean, if you feel like responding to them.
I'd be very happy if you sent me the chat questions or whatever questions there are, and I can also respond to them. But yeah, let's get the last two. I'll try and be brief.
Absolutely, absolutely. There's one from an anonymous attendee that says the definition and ideals of feminism are ever changing, especially in the fast-paced world of social media. Shall we and how should we accept all these notions, or shall we or should we filter through them carefully?
I think that's your choice. I don't think you have to accept all these notions. It is true they're ever changing, which is what makes it very exciting and challenging. And they're changing in response to our realities that are changing. But at the base of feminism lie some key things which are, I think, common and non-negotiable across the world, across classes. And these are things like equity, equality, respect, compassion, dignity for every human being, not only women, non-discrimination, no violence. I don't think that these things change. The need for these stays, no matter where you are, but they take different forms, different cultural forms, different political forms, and that's also means negotiating with change.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think just to kind of allow all the alums here to kind of hear some self-praise, I'll take a question from a prospective YF applicant. He or she is asking, I'm planning to apply to the YIF this year. What advice would you give me? Also, what brings you back to teach at the YIF every year? What is so special about Ashoka?
Well, I'd advise you, yes, if you're planning to apply, do apply. It's a very exciting course. And the YIF, I mean, by the course, I mean the whole course. And the YIF are a bunch of students. The fact that you're all located in the same place, which I hope will be the case by the time you join, That is very interesting for so many discussions that take place deep into the night. And I think the range of courses that are offered. I mean, I would love to take the course. I'd love to listen to Pratap. I'd love to listen to Dilip Simyan, who's an old friend of mine, and I've never heard him teach. And I'd love to learn from all of these teachers that you have and to question them. So I would say yes, do it. What is it that makes Ashoka so special? Well, I have found. I mean, let me talk from my experience. I found Ashoka to be very open. I have never been questioned on what I teach and the guest speakers I bring in. I bring in guest speakers all the time. To one of my last cohorts, I brought in a group of 3 sex workers, 2 women and 1 man. And nobody ever asked a question about it. I can imagine that if I tried to do this someplace else, I might be questioned about why I was bringing in, within quotes, bad people. So I've not had those kinds of questions. So I find it a very open place and exciting place to work in. So I'd say you should come in. Be aware that your cohort will largely be elite, but maybe you can puncture that and ask uncomfortable questions. After all, that's the point, no?
Correct. Absolutely. Comfortable questions or uncomfortable questions, I'm not sure, but I hope you did enjoy this conversation, Urvashi, and I hope everybody who's joined us today had something to take away from this very special session. Thank you once again to Professor Urvashi Butalia and to all our audience members, and of course to the YIF team for organizing this wonderful podcast series that really allows us to get a sneak peek into the personal and the political of some of our professors' lives. Thank you very much. Good night.
And thanks, Surya. Thanks, everyone. And bye. And do send me the questions. Okay.
I shall. Thank you.
Bye-bye.